Ready or Not argues for parental nurturing and supervision of young adults. The subtitle of the book is Why Treating Children as Small Adults Endangers Their Future and Ours. Author Kay Heimowitz explains her criticisms at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Ms. Heimowitz herself is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and an affiliate scholar at the Institute for American Values.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pat Fagan, the Fitzgerald Fellow, William Fitzgerald Fellow in Family and Culture here at the Heritage Foundation, and it's a delight to have you here. And it's a great delight for us at Heritage to be having Kay Heimowitz here with us on her fascinating book everybody is beginning to talk about, Ready or Not. Some of us have raised our children and say, well, it's a bit too late. And some of us are in the middle and say, well, we're not sure if we're ready. Today, Kay is going to review the book and give her own views. And the Q&A, I think, is going to be a key part to this. So we look forward to you doing this. Kay's background, she's a mother of three. Her oldest is now 21. When she was 3 years of age, this book began in some of the interactions between Kay and herself. Kay had studied at Brandeis, Tufts, and Columbia, and then rather than going on to pursue her doctorate, she veered into motherhood and family life. But as you can see, this has been the basis for the book itself. Today, she is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor with City Journal, and also an affiliate scholar with the Institute for American Values. All of these great groups that we work a lot with here at Heritage and are delighted to have as allies, and great to have Kay down here with us for the first time. Here with us here at Heritage Foundation. We hope by no means the last. And I think this book will have quite an effect on the debate in the country. The time is ready. People know what she's talking about. And as you will see, the ideas themselves within, that's what's happening to us in our ideas, is something that needs correcting. And Kay is going to point us in the right direction. My pleasure, Kay Heimowitz.
Thank you so much. It's true that there is something happening. People are aware that something's gone wrong with their kids. I've been doing a lot of talking, mostly on the radio around the country, and have been very struck with what I think is a national anxiety at this point about children. But I'm especially pleased to be here today at our cousin institution and have the benefit of your expertise. So many people here seem to know a great deal about trends that I'm just dimly aware of. I'm going to be talking maybe on a slightly different level than, or a different area from a different area of expertise than some of you are familiar with, but I think we can benefit from each other's conversation. Some of you may have noticed an ad several years ago that I was struck by. It showed a 7- or 8-year-old boy sitting on the steps of a house. He had a baseball mitt in one hand and a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken in the other. And the ad said, "Have dinner ready for Mom when she gets home." Now, the biologist, or rather the anthropologist Lionel Tiger, who wrote about that ad in a column, was impressed by what he called the epical reversal of tens of millions of years of mammalian dining. Where animals have always fed their young, here advertisers were suggesting we should turn things around. In fact, have we reached a stage where we no longer need to attend to either biology or, for that matter, millennia of human history? Is it the case that in our postmodern world, the young will feed the old? Tiger was pointing at something much more serious and larger than dining habits, of course. He was pointing at, if not an outright reversal of the roles of adult and children, then at least a blurring of those roles. You see examples of this blurring all through popular culture. I'll just give you one that came to my attention several years ago. I cite it in my book. where I found it in Time magazine. There's a picture of a middle-aged man with looking kind of concerned, and a teenage boy with his hands in his pocket looking kind of frustrated. And the text says, we should be having a talk about sex. And then it says, what do you want to know, Dad? So there we see it right there. There are movies and TV shows all over the place to prove that point. Tiger blames this shift in the roles between adults and children, the blurring of these roles, on the time crunch that I suspect many of you here are aware of, and I will tell you from the radio shows that I've been doing, the call-ins, that everybody is experiencing. And he's partly right. I think we do have to take cognizance of the fact that parents have a great deal less time than they once did for their children. But while this time crunch is essential for understanding the blurring of boundaries between adult and child, it is not, as I argue in my book, by any means the whole story. What I'm arguing here is that the changes in childhood we are witnessing today are not in the inevitable consequence of changing demographics, or for that matter, the growing presence of a hypersexualized media, but to a far greater degree than has been previously understood, a consequence of conscious human design. In the last 30 years, we have seen the emergence of a new and seriously misguided set of ideas about what children are like and what adults' responsibility towards them is. These ideas have come from educators, from experts, from child advocates, from judges and lawyers, and of course the media. And they boil down to this. Children, we seem to be hearing all the time, are rational, self-aware, morally mature, and autonomous. Therefore, it follows that the universal understanding that the job of adults to induct children into a pre-existing society, into a web of meaning, into a culture, no longer makes any sense. Our prodigies can take care of themselves and raise themselves. This is the fallacy that I call in my book anti-culturalism. Instead of grasping the profound truth that children are shaped by their culture, and I don't mean just their values and beliefs, but their very grasp of their own identity and their place in the world, our experts have concluded that children pretty much shape themselves. They are anti-cultural. They develop apart from and often in opposition to culture. What I'd like to do in the time remaining is give you about 3 examples I think we'll only have time for, that will try to clarify for you what I'm saying and what this idea, this anti-cultural fallacy actually is. I want to demonstrate 2 things. One, how pervasive this fallacy is in our thinking, and 2, how its impact is to abandon and isolate children and to leave them in many cases to their own worst impulses. My first example comes from the field of psychology and concerns infants. I'm very fond of this material. It's in the chapter that I call Baby Geniuses, mostly because I'm not sure people are aware of it, but yet, though they're not consciously aware of it, I suspect it's had a big impact on their thinking. In the 1970s, research psychologists came up with a theory of what they called, and you'll like this, the competent infant. As researchers began, that's their term, I'm not making that one up. As researchers began to take advantage of new technologies in the 60s, such as the video camera, they were amazed to see that infants were capable of far more than anyone had imagined. They then announced in statements like this, quote, "From his earliest days, every infant is an active, perceiving, learning, and information organizing individual, an entirely new view of the infant." This phrase, the competent infant, never developed common currency, but the image of the autonomous infant overachiever exploring and learning about the world by himself and for himself persists in the mainstream media today. Your child is a genius, begins one 1985 self-help book. His or her capacity for learning is virtually limitless. I recently read about a video called Baby Einstein, and I suspect it's only half tongue-in-cheek, that title. You can see some of the very same high expectations about infants and young children in some of the leading advice books of this same period that I'm trying to describe. Things we think we must impose on children, for instance, Dr. Spock wrote, are actually things they enjoy learning to do themselves. Don't insist your youngster try new foods or eat his peas, Penelope Leach says. Trust him to know best. How do we know when a child is ready to be toilet trained? One popular advice book called What to Expect the Toddler Years answers, look no further than your toddler for the answer. Only your child can tell you. Current theories from sociobiologists confirm the picture of this competent infant. Children, even babies, we learn, are naturally empathic. That's why newborns cry if they hear their dorm mates wailing in the hospital nursery. I don't have any reason to argue with the idea. I don't have any reason to dispute the idea that empathy is natural to human beings, and I don't have any reason to dispute the idea that babies are learning. But nowhere in this picture of the independent and kindly information organizer do we get any sense of the child's less obliging side, the irrational behaviors, the restlessness, the cruelty, and the boundless egotism that we all know, we who are parents. I always find it particularly surprising that sociobiologists are coming up with these theories that only emphasize this obliging side to children. I mean, after all, they are trying to trace back our roots to animal behavior, and I wasn't aware that it was so wonderful out there in the jungle, but that's what we seem to be hearing. James Q. Wilson remarked that he was surprised upon looking at contemporary books on moral development to see nothing about self-restraint. Well, he shouldn't have been surprised. Our baby Einsteins and toddler Gandhis have no impulses to restrain. Indeed, the word impulse, and this is a kind of interesting fact, I think, has disappeared from expert and advice literature. It does not exist. Even the word instinct has been transformed. It is now used in the context of, let's say, the language instinct, that is, a very constructive and benign side to the individual. Notice how, when you have these baby geniuses and the competent infants, the parental role, particularly that of the mother, starts to shift. Parents are no longer the experienced members of a culture whose jobs it is to teach the limits of the egotism and the meanings of the world around them. They are merely personal trainers and companions along for the ride. This is indeed an epochal shift in mammalian nurture. Now, let's go to the next stage. We've looked at the infant. Let's look at the school child. You can see a lot of the same anti-cultural ideas in American education theories. According to many of our educrats, we should empower children to choose what to learn, how to learn it, and even in some theories, how they should be graded. A 1998 study from Public Agenda found that only 7% of education professors think teachers should be, quote, conveyors of knowledge who enlighten students with what they know. 92% believe teachers should only, quote, enable students to learn on their own. Once again, the shift between adult and children. You see, I can give you a couple of other examples. The new standards for the English arts, published by the International Reading Association and the National Council of Teachers of English, says that, quote, children's perspective, interests, and needs should shape classroom discussion, writing projects, and curriculum choices. I personally was able to attest to the dominance of these ideas when I went to my daughter's school for a curriculum conference. And the teacher, sixth grade life science teacher, announced very excitedly that he had asked the students what they would like to study. And surprise, surprise, they answered the human body. I don't know whether he was expecting mollusks or what, but he got the human body, and he announced that he was going to restructure the curriculum because this is what the children wanted to study. Now, this is education by student poll. Throughout history, though, human beings have imagined education as a process whereby an experienced and knowledgeable teacher passes the knowledge considered meaningful in that culture on to the ignorant and inexperienced young. No longer. We don't have cultural education. We have anti-cultural education. Our children do not need to be taught. In fact, they don't even need teachers. In the current argot, we have facilitators, managers of instruction, or coaches. One expert even suggests we use the term co-learners, which which I find very, very suggestive about what's going on between adults and children now. It is, in my mind, when I read things like that, no wonder that such a worrisome percentage of teachers are leaving the field. My next example of anti-cultural thinking comes from the field of sexuality theory. Here again, experts have taken up the anti-cultural approach. You let the kids make their own decisions, right? And you teach them how to make their own decisions. I sometimes think that conservatives have overstated how much X-rated stuff is going on in classrooms. My experience has been that it's more neutral than that, if that's the proper word. Certainly by 1981, according to the Guttmacher Institute, 94% of school districts agreed that the major goal of sex education ought to be, quote, informed decision-making. And they set about to teach children decision-making skills, refusal skills, communication skills. And if these don't work, stress management skills and goal-setting skills, whatever these all are, I don't know. The decision-making model is anti-cultural in this sense. It assumes that kids already possess the values, the beliefs, and the self-awareness that go into such decisions. They are their own parents and teachers. Take the example from that very popular book, Reviving Ophelia, by Mary Pfeiffer. She tells us that she would advise her young patients. She was a psychologist before she turned into a popular writer. She would advise her young patients, deeply troubled girls, all of them, to find a quiet place and ask themselves, how do I feel right now? What do I think? What are my values? Once they have discovered their own true selves, she continues, I encourage them to trust that self as the source of meaning and direction in their lives. It seems that even younger teens have access to what Pfeiffer calls their own true selves. I looked at a program for 7th and 8th graders. It uses the same decision-making model, and even came across a dispute, the statement of a woman in a dispute in New York City during an AIDS education crisis, and where she said to her district school board, the more information you give people, the better choices they make. She was referring to lessons for 9- and 10-year-olds. Now, those of you who have teenagers at home or have had any experience with teenagers, those of you who have any dim memory of being a teenager, may recall an alternately insecure and grandiose, idealistic and crude, moody and perpetually glandular creature. But not according to our experts, no. As you can see, the competent infant and the self-directing, self-grading grade schooler has grown up to become the rational, self-aware, and independent-minded teenager. It seems we really have nothing to teach such marvelous creatures. In the course of my research, I came across a very poignant description by a woman named Cheryl Jaffe in a book called Ground Rules. Ms. Jaffe has 2 children, and her older teenage girl was having one of those times that parents just that terrify parents so much. The child, I think it was at 15, was disappearing overnight, was beginning to look more and more degenerate, and the mother had every reason to be deeply concerned. So she went to talk to the family therapist. What should she say to her child? All you should say, he said, is, I hope you practice safe sex. I hope you practice safe sex, I said to her one day, and she gave me a look of disdain. I hope you practice safe sex, she said back to me in a mocking tone. Why had she mocked me? Because she didn't need to be told to practice safe sex? Because, of course, she would practice safe sex? Or was she taunting me because she bitterly resented me, making assumptions about her sex life? The last possibility I thought of was that she was mocking me because she could tell my words were from the therapist's script. These weren't my words at all. I was a foolish woman without any words of my own. I find this a very poignant statement. I think that there are a lot of parents out there who really don't have words of their own anymore when it comes to talking to their kids about sex. I need to stress that adults like my daughter's life science teacher and Cheryl Jaffe do not do these things out of laziness or stupidity. They are acting out of a sincere belief that they are respecting and empowering children's individuality, freeing them to be themselves. But what they don't understand is this difficult human truth. Human beings are born unfinished selves who require experience within a culture to complete them. This means something a great deal more than human beings are born lacking information and lacking skills. It means that they are wired to pick up rules about how to act, what to believe, what values to hold dear, how to dress and behave. They are searching for meaning. So what happens when adults only show them their empty hands in that search for meaning? What happens when adults refuse to teach children in the most basic and broadest sense? Well, it's not the liberation that people imagined. Children are not, as I keep saying, the self-aware and completed creatures we have dreamt of. And absent a clear message from adults, they will look to their peers, who in turn look to the media to help explain the world and to endow it with glamour and meaning. This has long been the predicament of adolescents as they've broken away from their parents. But today it is more and more school-age children, freed from adult guidance, if that's the proper word, who turn to their friends, who in turn rely on the media. The consequence is what I call in one of my chapters the teening of childhood. At ever younger ages, we are seeing kids look and behave like teenagers. And in some ways, more alarming, the peer group has become much more dominant in middle school and in late elementary school in a way that it never was before. Teachers and principals see an increasing number of 10 and 11-year-olds who have given up toys for hair mousse and name brand jeans and who heckle those who do not. According to this one marketing researcher who I spoke to, this new breed of child is the primary wish of this new breed of child is, quote, being part of the in crowd, being the first to know what's cool. This is not liberation. For some kids, as adults abdicate their power, the group becomes a kind of surrogate family. I don't know how many of you saw the special on that was produced by Frontline. I have a feeling some of you did, 2 weeks ago or so. The Lost Children of Rockdale County, it was called, and it was a really staggering description of a syphilis outbreak among teenagers as young as 13 in a suburban neighborhood of Atlanta. And this was one of the things that was most striking to me about that special, is that the kids turned to their group of friends as a kind of family, like a tribe, and of course were desperate to do whatever the tribe insisted they do, even when that involved the most promiscuous group sex. Some kids were reported 50 partners or more. When the producers interviewed the kids, it was clear their behavior was, to use a phrase that you sometimes see when people are trying to grasp whether kids have been abused or not, that their behavior was, quote, voluntary but not wanted. They were doing what their friends expected them to do. Let me see, I thought I had, what happens, of course, as a result of this, I'm sorry, I lost my train here, is that adults are basically saying to kids, we have nothing to tell you. We don't have any meanings to teach you. And I think that the ultimate message is not that you are a free individual to make your own choices. It is really that nothing much matters. We have no stake in our own or our culture's meanings and traditions. It doesn't matter if you study the human body or mollusks. It doesn't matter if you have sex with one partner or with many. One girl in the Frontline special was quoted as saying, the first time that you have sex, you think it's because it means something. But then you realize it doesn't. You just don't care anymore. We've seen a lot of, in the press, of kids who are going berserk with guns, of kids like these kids in the Frontline special who are having promiscuous sex. But I think the scariest thing, and the thing we need to really attend to, is that these kids who feel you just don't care anymore. That is the message that I think what adults give when they say, we have nothing to teach you. And I would love to have some questions from you all. Thank you.
I have a first question, just to get it rolling, if I may. Traditionally, all the great religions have taught that human nature is fallen in some way. They've also taught that man is made for eternity, with a great purpose in front. And all that's happening seems to be in contradiction to that. Do our elites believe this anymore? It seems to me, and I'm putting the question, the juxtaposition between the tradition versus the leaders of our society today, and where our society is at.
Yeah. One of the things that I was surprised to discover in the course of my research was that the experts and the so-called elites really forgot about this other side to human nature. Now, my understanding is that that's not inconsistent with an American tradition. Americans are optimists about people, about human nature, and in my book, in the first chapter, I go into the history of American thinking about child rearing. I was fascinated to see that ministers and intellectuals in the early 19th century were already looking for a new way to raise children and to think about children, and giving them a lot more space, as they would say today, respecting their individual ambitions and energies. So there was a kind of optimism that I think we Americans have in our tradition, and that I don't want to get rid of entirely. But we need it balanced with, I think, with an understanding of this other side of human nature. It really is lost in the expert literature right now, and I think it's one of the reasons that we're seeing a lot of the behavior among kids that we are, because adults simply are not prepared for having that job anymore of taming that side of the child. Yeah. Yes.
I know the problem you identify is not one that is going to be solved by government. It's a cultural decay. But since I work in Congress, I always take those approaches. A couple of years ago, in the 104th Congress, in fact, we had legislation intended to recognize that the rights of parents were first. Not that they were exclusive, not that they were absolute, but that they were first before anybody else had any rights in deciding how children were to be raised. And that legislation died mainly because of the active and very, very aggressive opposition of what I would consider to be an iron triangle of people who are dedicated to keeping parents out of the way. And the three prongs of this included, on the one hand, social workers, the profession of social workers, and people who worked with children. I understand their motivation. I mean, I don't agree with it, but they see the worst cases, and so they're predisposed to think of parents as potential abusers. The second element was people who ideologically are committed to this equality of children. The American Civil Liberties Union, Planned Parenthood, those folks. But the third element is the one that bothered me the most, because it was the public school establishment who appeared to resist this mainly because they didn't want to be held accountable. And it seems to me to be a very unhealthy situation when parents and teachers, at least one side of that dialogue, feels itself to be in competition rather than in partnership. Yeah. For the good of children. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I have a caution. I'm interested to hear that the public school establishment reacted that way, and it's alarming. On the other hand, I am hearing many educators complain, and I suspect that they're telling the truth here, about parents who are not pulling their weight with kids. They go to the parents after a child has gotten into trouble, and the parent says, "What are you bothering my kid for?" Or, "Why are you making such a big deal?" There's a story just the other day about a kid who wrote a Halloween story in which he, I can't remember who it was he was going to murder, but, you know, he had a list in this story, and the school suspended him, which, by the way, I'm not sure was the proper response, but something had to happen. The mother's only reaction was, "Why are they so overreacting? It's just a story." I heard the same thing in that incident in Cleveland last week, where several teenagers were arrested who seemed to be planning some kind of massacre at their school, and one of the parents said, "Oh, it was just a teenage prank." So I think that the schools do feel beleaguered by parents, and in many cases, rightfully so. Parents who are not helping them in the task of socializing children. There's a lot of there is an adversarial feeling now, and I'm not sure I'm only on the side of the parents in this. So I would just caution you to remember that side. Yeah.
Well, first, I'd like to congratulate you because it's a very much needed saying, so and you said it very well. So, thank you. Just one sentence about the historical context. I think it would make a difference if you have a society which is very uptight and authoritarian and religious, and somebody comes like Rousseau and tries to make it a little elbow, or you come in a society which is anarchic and so. So I would like to put the argument into context. I think it's even more important today than it would have been 100 years ago. And just one more thing on your side. There are specific battles as we speak on this issue. So for instance, when people in the libraries in Virginia and in California put filters on computers so children 12 years or younger could not access them freely, the civil libertarians came in. So in the last issue of Dissent was an article that children of all ages, have full First Amendment rights. And so it is just a lot of stuff. But I want to ask you, how aware are you that you are not only blowing a hole in the civil libertarian and left liberalship, but people at Cato won't love you either. And let me see for a moment why, and see if you agree. The major line between social conservatives and libertarian on this issue is, again, what you assume how people start their journey. The libertarians assume, as Ken Bolin put it, that people are born at age 21 with their preferences in place. Why? Because the moment you concede, this is the essential argument, that children are shaped by not by rational, not by giving them information, but by example, by persuasion, by education, then the notion that when they come to 21, the bell rings, and all these processes stop. From then on, they're fully autonomous, being able to make their own decision, is just untenable. And therefore, I would think that, in all seriousness, the libertarians would be as unhappy with you as my friends on the left, my former friends on the left.
Let me clarify, because they would not want this concept of that you just stop growing at 21, that you become a full-fledged and complete person.
Culture, as you put it, I think very well. It's exactly like term. Shapes people,
right.
Then they can rebel or change it, but the initial being is shaped by their culture. Means they are not autonomous being,
yes.
Initially, right?
Yes.
So now, if there would be this fantastic switch, once you get bar mitzvah or whatever, the switch flips, and from now on, you're self-propelling, but it's just ain't so.
Well, you're asking very difficult questions, I'm sure you know. I kind of struggled with this question as I read a lot of anthropology when I was writing the book, and came to the conclusion that to a certain extent the postmodernists are right, that identity is constructed. But here's the wrinkle. I think that that individuality is something that's taught, and that what you're essentially doing with a child in this country, hopefully, is giving them a language with which to imagine a fuller and broader self, that they do need that language. It won't happen by itself. I mean, if you look at my chapter on baby geniuses, one of the things I mentioned there is that there are many cultures where the infant is barely talked to, for instance. American mothers are known to engage their babies very actively, to call them by name, to encourage response. What I think they're doing is teaching them how to be individuals, if that makes sense. So there's an inherent paradox there, which I understand. Now, I'm still not clear why it's problematic for society to say, all right, we've given you 18, 21 years, whatever arbitrary point we draw, and it will be somewhat arbitrary. I'm not sure why it's a problem for society to say, we've given you 18 years, now go to it. You know, we've taught you as much as we can about what it means to live in this society. Now it's up to you to be an adult in that society. I also want to make a related point, which is that what's interesting is that the more we treat children as if they already have this cultural material, the less they grow up. I mean, my last chapter is entitled Postmodern Post-Adolescence, and it's really about 20-somethings who are still children and feel themselves to be children. So I guess I'm not clear. I'm not clear why it's such a big problem.
There's one thing. First of all, I completely agree with you that you teach people how to be autonomous. But then you're at 21 or whatever, 23, you go to church, and a minister tells you, you didn't do enough for the poor, or whatever. It means he appeals to some values which are in you, right, and makes you act not because simply share information with you, but he influences you, I hope, to the good. Mm-hmm. That's not different from the parent, though.
That's not different from the parent, is that what you're saying?
No, because he appeals to you.
No,
rational decision-making mind, but to the way you can be persuaded.
Well, but it seems to me that's not, you can't make that distinction so clearly, but part of what you're doing in those 18 or 21 years in a free society is training a rational being who can be appealed to through the heart for sure, but has the reason to evaluate those appeals. And that's why, so I don't see, I think there is a difference then with those appeals when you're 21, hopefully. We know many people for whom that's not the case. That's our goal. Yeah.
The assumption that's out there that you discovered about the baby Einsteins and toddler Gandhis, I love that expression, toddler Gandhi. What cultural institution would you want to target first to try to turn that around, and what do you suspect would be the most persuasive argument with the people who dominate that institution?
I hadn't really thought about that question. If you ask me in the broadest sense, I'd say the first institution I'd like to affect the courts. Not so much for the youngest children, but for the students. I have a chapter on how, I'll bet most of you know here, how much the courts have made it impossible for the schools to be socializing institutions and to be they're more government organizations like any other. So that's the first place I would go. As for the baby Einsteins, this is going to be an extremely difficult battle, and I'll tell you why. There is tremendous pressure on parents right now to make sure their child is achieving at the highest possible level. Any of you with children or who know people with children are seeing people, they're going crazy. They're putting their kids in school at the youngest ages when they're really not ready. I have a friend of mine came to me recently and said that a woman said to her that her daughter had just started in a new school, at first grader. She said, I knew she was at the right school because she came home the first day and told me the speed of light. I thought, this is the mindset is, achieve, achieve, achieve. This is what Piaget called the American question. How can you push kids ever farther, ever faster beyond their capacities? This is going to be almost an impossible thing to fight because I think the economic forces are so powerful now, and people really do shape their child rearing to a certain extent around what they think the future is for their kids. So they imagine that what their kids need the most are really terrific, high-achieving education. And I'm not trying to say it isn't important, but what's happened is we're forgetting the other side, the social, the emotional, the cultural side, as I put it in the broadest sense. I don't have an really clear answer for your question. I'm just trying to say how difficult I think it would be. Yeah, Ricky.
This is going to follow up, I think, to both questions. Adolescents have always been anti-cultural. It doesn't make any difference in what age you brought up adolescents. I think the problem that we face today, as I like to say, is adolescents have been stretched at both ends to almost 30 years. They start at 20 years. They start at 10 and they go to 30. And if the institution that might be, this is why 21, I think it no longer has any resonance whatsoever. I don't know whether this is an institution, but it seems to me that part of the problem is in the way we look at sexuality in society, and the fact that adolescents today are grown-ups very, very early in terms of their behavior and what is expected of them, and yet they don't have any of the civilizing influences, boys, and having to couple up and be a husband and a father, and girls in getting married and having children, that really drive them out of adolescence. That's the only way you stop being an adolescent, really.
I agree. I agree. I've gradually come to conclude, and maybe this is just because I have a 21-year-old son, that we ought to be pushing for earlier marriage. Yeah, I think so. I think this period of delayed adolescence is not productive either for the individuals involved in many cases or for the society.
Miserable. These kids, 20-year-olds, are miserable.
Yeah. And equally important, they are not productive citizens. They're hard workers. I find that, I'm actually going to try to do some work on this. What I find fascinating is that they're not the slackers that we were told they were. In fact, they're extremely ambitious. Many in this generation, they put work first, I think. But what I'm not sure about is the other side. I think that's what you're drawing attention to. And you know, they're voting in small numbers, and they're detached from the society in a profound way, which is very much related to their lack of a family and lack of commitment on that level. So I think it's highly problematic. I'm very interested in this theme of I talked about the teening of childhood, but it's really the teening of America. We're all teenagers here. It's a theme in popular culture to an extent that's extraordinary. And what I think the most important point that I can add to it is that the problems in childhood that I'm talking about are really the problems of adulthood. And what we've lost is any sense of what the adult is, the caretaker, the one who hands down the society. That seems to be gone. We just sort of leave the kids off to themselves. So. Yeah, one thing that's occurred to me through my research is that if we were denying kids more rights, more pleasures even, the urge to grow up would be stronger. So I think this is partly, I remember reading, I think it was Joseph Epstein had a wonderful essay where he said in the 50s, all you wanted to do was grow up, because when you grew up, you could have sex, you could drink, you could smoke, you could do all that stuff. He said, now kids are doing that, so what's the hurry to grow up? There are no pleasures associated with adulthood. So, yeah.
You point out many problems getting to the state that you've described. Two in particular, I'd like you to talk about the relationship between them. On the one hand, you seem to suggest that what's behind this phenomena is really a growing problem stemming from the problem of modern rights theory, which suggests a little bit more of a legalistic sense of everyone has rights, why shouldn't children have rights, therefore they can do whatever they want. But on the other hand, much of this stems, I think, in your book suggests, also stems from the rise of modern kind of scientific behavioralism. Yes. And the remnants of scientific theories of how children should grow up. These aren't necessarily opposed to each other. I'm sure they're widely intertwined. But depending on which one you see as the main driver in causing the problem, your solution might be slightly different. Because in many ways, social science is now working against the scientific side of that argument. But the rights argument seems to be kind of going about its merry way. I was wondering whether you might relate those two.
Just clarify for me how it is the social science part is working against it, because I wouldn't know.
Well, there are many things. I'm just thinking in general terms of a lot of the social science work that's being done today about the family.
Oh,
and
yes.
That actually is working against the kind of behavioral studies you saw in the 60s and 70s. There's some optimism potentially there on that front.
Yeah. I think, though, I'm glad you brought this point up, because sometimes I think I'm emphasizing the rights piece too much, and I really do try in this book to get at this other theme that you're talking about, that is that there is a kind of technological, scientific reason that children have been redefined as rational information processors. There's nothing to do with right, or it's not clearly connected to rights theory. But I guess I'm not as sanguine that the social sciences are changing that much. I mean, what I've been struck with is that the infant that I described, the competent infant, that phrasing has gone away. Instead, we get the computer brain, the baby with the computer brain. And it seems to me that that is swamping still the other kinds of social science, at least in the mainstream magazines. If you pick up a lot of the parenting magazines, there's talk, it's true, there's talk about discipline and the importance of love and all of that stuff, but it really is about, how can your child achieve? How, I remember coming across an article, I allude to it in the book, by one prominent psychologist who says, love, how to boost your baby's IQ. So I don't, I'm not convinced that this other strain of social science is having that much impact on some of the conversation about what we're doing with our kids specifically. It may be in political circles, it probably is. Certainly the research on the effects of divorce on children and that sort of thing may be driving some political theory.
Looking back in terms of the creation of the problem, which of those two do you think is more the driver, or is it?
Do I have
are
to?
You capable of, no,
if I had to pick one, I don't want to pick one. I'm going to refuse. I'll tell you why. I think they both emerge out of an American tradition. And I do think that these are a lot of the mistakes that I'm describing here are completely understandable given our thinking about our American civic religion, which basically says, you are an autonomous creature, and you should not have an authority impinging on your decisions. And the fact is, I think that parents in America are really doing something that is kind of contradictory to their deepest beliefs. I mean, I know I'm putting it in overly simplistic terms in a way, but I think so. I guess I would say that both the rights tradition, the rights talk, and the scientific strain are consistent with that push. The American tradition, which says that each individual has to be treated with total dignity and respect, which, really and truly is a problem when we're dealing with children. Hi, Barbara.
But that tradition in the past was grounded in another tradition simultaneously, which was a religious tradition. And once you throw over the religious tradition, which I kind of view as the superstructure, and within a tradition, whichever tradition it is, then you can be free. But within that superstructure, without the superstructure, you're just flailing around. And what you've ended up doing, I think what you're saying, is substituting the religious substance. You're substituting narcissism, whatever you think. So you have religion now virtually, well, we have these new sects and a kind of paganism and this new age religion where it's not the other, it's always you, and what comes from you determines what's right and what isn't right. So that, in effect, what you've done now, what I think is, from your very depressing talk, is is a combination of Animal Farm in 1984, where you have these super intelligent automatons with zero humanity.
All right, you've given me quite an earful. Yes. I think I often am asked by people, well, you don't want to go back, to that seen but not heard childhood, and I try to. Do you? Do you? People say to me, but what I'm. Well, I don't know your kids, so maybe. Maybe you're right. There are moments, yes, but what I do try to say is that I think each era has its own battles to fight, and that if we're really listening to kids now, what we're going to hear is this kind of emptiness and the narcissism you're talking about, because after all, that kind of self-involvement ultimately is empty. My husband is a psychologist, so he says, it's another. In a way, my book is another argument about the emergence of narcissism. I think that's right. Yeah. Yes.
You wrote an article recently about marketing to tweens.
Oh, yes.
She's sort of called like the new emerging group. And I was hoping you would just sort of comment on that. My boss recently did a hearing on marketing violence to children, things that even when they have an adult label seem to be geared directly toward teenagers. Just a couple days ago, Halloween, I had about 24 kids come to the house. The only costume that was repeated was the Scream outfit.
I saw that,
and there was
yes.
like a half dozen kids, like 8 and under, wearing, the Scream murder outfit. And secondly, I was just hoping you would comment on how does this affect girls and boys differently?
This is actually a favorite topic of mine because I have a tween at home, and she is my sort of laboratory animal for this kind of. I've noticed one of the reasons I got interested in writing about tweens is that I noticed a very profound acceleration between her older brother and sister at that age and her. That is, tweens, by the way, are between 8 and 12. That's a great group between 8 and 12. She was much more conscious of the market, much more focused on fashion, aware of labels. And this is not a difference in temperament, I'm convinced. I'm seeing it with too many other children. The reason that I think that it happens more with girls, and it does, and marketers know it does, and they are targeting girls more than boys, is because girls are more socially aware. This is one of the differences between the sexes. They grow, and they do grow up faster in that as well. They grow up faster biologically, but they grow up faster also in that sense. They're more attuned to those social signals. Now, they are the opinion leaders often in middle school, and so that they are bringing the boys along with them somewhat. Not all boys. I still hear that from mothers occasionally about their sixth graders who they just can't figure it out. They're not interested. They're still interested in baseball cards, and they seem to be worried. I quite understand it. But the marketing intensified in the late 80s. Marketing to this age group intensified in the late 80s. If you look at the history of it, is quite remarkable. Around 1989, you suddenly saw a whole slew of new magazines targeting these kids. Now, that seems very nice. Those of us who have kids know that it's nice to have magazines for our children. But I'm afraid that what it means is that that fashion companies and all sorts of other companies were realizing that kids could have power in determining what was purchased. And in those magazines, you see ads, believe it or not, from American Airlines, IBM. Kids, they say, are this is a quote I came across, the opinion leaders of the household. You know, so this is, this is one of those cultural contradictions of capitalism, isn't it? I'm afraid that one of the things I try to argue with this is that the old-fashioned protected childhood didn't just protect children from information they couldn't handle about sex or death or violence or whatever. It also protected children from the market, with all its pressures and all its fads. And that's something that parents, from what I can see, have given, they don't even think it's a problem in many cases. They think, I don't know, they figure, well, that's their culture, their life. And they are very, very savvy. And of course the problem is that you see more kids who are more status conscious in those terms. Who has what, who owns what, who's wearing what cut of jean, or what kind of sneaker and that sort of thing. But I just will mention very briefly that my daughter was invited to a birthday party recently for a girl who's turning 11. You might think that would mean a sleepover with pajamas and ice cream and cake, but in fact they were taken by stretch limousines to a Japanese restaurant, and that girl became very popular as a result of that. For the meantime, I don't want to say it's going to last, but that is the world that these kids are living in. Yeah.
Do you see any lessening of the enthusiasm in education establishment for the decision-making model?
Yeah, well, certainly it seems that way. We are hearing a strong counter-movement, aren't we, from testing. People believe in testing and standards and that sort of thing. What's of concern is that the establishment in the ed schools, I'm not sure they get it yet. For instance, we had this debate on, as most of you must know, on whole language, which was very much driven by the prevalence of whole language, very much driven by the ed schools. And I think they're beginning to say, well, yeah, maybe some phonics, maybe. But I'm not sure they're teaching it. I actually don't know a lot about what's going on, but I'm not convinced that at the highest levels of theory that we're really getting through. So, Adam?
Conservative policymakers have erased the distinction between adulthood and childhood in one area, and that's juvenile justice. And in your book, you raise a very interesting question about perhaps whether conservatives have gone too far in treating juvenile criminals as adults. How should we think about punishing children who are also criminals?
One of the things that happened as a result of various legal decisions in the late 60s and 70s was that we saw much less emphasis on minor crimes, much less emphasis on pursuing kids who were guilty of minor infractions, because there was so much, there had to be so much legal effort that went into, defending each child. And when it came to stealing a bicycle or maybe writing graffiti, it was just as easy to kind of let them off. And I think what happens in so many cases is that the kids who are going to become, as they're known in some circles, the sharks, they start as minnows. They start with minor infractions, but they're not getting a message. at those early stages. The adversarial system of the courts and the child creates a very different kind of atmosphere than what it should be, which is that the courts are engaged in a kind of socialization. They're helping to teach the child as well as to punish him. And what I'm saying is that we're going to have kids who then we have at age 15 who are committing what we think of as adult crimes because we haven't dealt with them earlier on. So the first thing I'd want to do is try to redefine the juvenile court back to what it was originally, which is, as I say, a kind of socializing institution. Then the problem is when you do have kids who are guilty of her most horrendous crimes, we need to balance, and I don't have a clear answer for this. We need to balance two things. One, the child's incompleteness that I keep talking about, and two, the community's need for some expression of outrage at what's happened. And I think we're going too far towards the expression of outrage and forgetting about the child in many cases. So that's what I think we need to be thinking about.
We have time for one last question.
Okay. Yes.
Two quick comments, and then really a question about clarification. I think marketing to children started 25 years ago with Sesame Street. If you take a look at what it does, it teaches commercial awareness better than any other possible thing in our culture. If you talk about the schools are not run by teachers. Schools are run by the NEA and the AFT, and if we don't understand the political ramifications of that, we're crazy. But my question is one of clarification, because in your earlier discussion, you had a phrase, 50 partners or more, when you were talking about people having sex. I don't know whether you were quoting that or whether that's your semantics.
No, this was in this, that wasn't a general statement, that was a statement in this particular.
I don't think that partner is a word which comes from business, and partner is a BS word, which has been applied by the anti-culturalists to try to, cover over the fact that there had 50 perpetrators or more. I think that to the extent that you are going to be out talking and promoting your book and promoting these thoughts, it's incredibly important not to use the semantics in any case of the people who are part of the anti-cultural movement. And I think because you lose the semantics, you grant them the semantic turf, you lose it entirely.
Well, first of all, I want to say something about Sesame Street, just because I have written on the subject, and I agree with you, it was a great marketing device. Although the marketing to children started significantly before that. It started as in the earlier part of the century, actually. It just, we didn't have television to do it so well. As for the question about partners, I would ask you, what do you have in its stead? Perpetrator strikes me as problematic. It implies that that there's a victim, a perpetrator and a victim. No, these were all teenagers.
As a matter of law, people who have sexual intercourse, and we need to use that word, not sex, because that's what we're talking about. People who have sexual intercourse with minors are guilty of a crime.
If they are a minor as well?
Yes. So, it's very important not to let the culture, Planned Parenthood should not redefine family law, especially for persons who are social conservatives.
I'll have to give it some thought, but it's an interesting point. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your questions.
Well, Kay, we definitely want to thank you for provoking all sorts of things. I almost feel like giving a speech after that because of what it entails, but it continues to raise the temperature of concern, if I can mix my metaphors, on what is happening to our children, but also, as the subtitle of your book points to, where is the nation heading? What is America going to be like 20, 30 years from now as these people take the reins? I know where I'm inclined to head. It's back to the family, and I think, as you pointed out, back to faith, back to church, back to the ultimate and the eternal verities and rebuilding from there. I think your book is definitely going to provoke us all to think harder and maybe start acting differently. Thank you very much, Kay. Well, you have a couple of minutes, I'm sure. Yeah. We'll be able to. Yeah, actually.
I enjoyed it very much.
Well, I'll have to think about it.
Having been, as a young parent, having been victimized by Cephas, I can tell you that.
Yeah, no, it's a very, it is a very, it's very wrong.
No, it's not.
The other thing that you could work in if you chose, the lionization of this woman who is the editor of Psychological Texts, who says parenting is really irrelevant. Everything is peer, therefore it's all genetics and peer.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Articles by Kay Heimowitz have appeared in the New Republic, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Ready or Not is published by the Free Press, a division of Simon & Schuster.